For decades, the United States has stood unchallenged as the world's dominant superpower, its military unmatched, its economy the backbone of global trade, and its influence shaping international policies. But what if that era is coming to an end? BRICS is expanding, more nations are ditching the US dollar, and a new world order is taking shape. Countries that once followed Washington's lead are now forging their own paths, making deals with rivals like China and Russia. So, if America's grip on global power is slipping, what happens next? Will the world become more balanced, or more chaotic? And more importantly, is the US ready for what comes next? For much of modern history, the United States has been the world's undisputed leader, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. With the world's strongest military, the dollar at the center of global trade, and a vast network of allies, American influence has shaped everything from wars to financial markets. But today, that dominance is being challenged like never before. Many experts warn that America's grip on global power is eroding faster than we realize. China is rising as an economic powerhouse, BRICS nations are pushing to replace the dollar, and even longtime US allies are starting to question Washington's leadership. So, what does this shift mean for the future? This is Elite Global Watch, where we simplify the complex and reveal the hidden. In this video, we'll break down 3 critical areas where America's influence is fading: the global economy, military dominance, and shifting alliances, and explore whether the US can hold its position in a rapidly changing world. The rise of new powers. Main argument: for decades, the United States shaped the global order. But today, new challengers are rising, reshaping the balance of power and threatening America's long-held dominance. China's growing influence, the superpower in waiting. China is no longer just a rising power, it's an economic titan. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing is pouring trillions into infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, winning over nations that once relied on the US. At the same time, China's military is rapidly expanding, developing advanced weapons and flexing its strength in the South China Sea. But it's not just military power. China is also making moves to undermine the dollar's dominance, setting up trade agreements in yuan and creating financial systems that bypass the West entirely. BRICS and dedollarization, a challenge to the US dollar. BRICS, once just an economic alliance, is now becoming a real geopolitical force. With new members joining, this group of emerging economies is directly challenging Western financial control. More and more countries are moving away from the dollar, using local currencies for trade and even discussing a new BRICS-backed currency. This shift threatens the very foundation of America's power, the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. If countries no longer need US dollars for trade, the US loses a major economic advantage, making it harder to impose sanctions and control global markets. Europe distancing from the US, cracks in the alliance. Even America's closest allies are reconsidering their dependence. Europe has long relied on the US for military protection through NATO, but tensions are growing. Some European leaders have called for a more independent military strategy, fearing that Washington's shifting priorities, especially after recent US foreign policy failures, could leave them vulnerable. At the same time, economic interests are pulling Europe in new directions. The EU is increasing trade with China and looking for energy alternatives beyond the US. With Washington pushing aggressive policies, many European nations are asking, do we still need to follow America's lead? Together, these forces are shaping a new world order, one where the US is no longer the undisputed global leader. The question now is, can America adapt, or will it be left behind? Economic decline and the dollar's struggles. For decades, the US dollar has been the backbone of global trade, giving America enormous power over the world economy. But today, that dominance is under attack from all sides. The US debt crisis, a ticking time bomb. The US national debt has skyrocketed to over $36 trillion, and it's only getting worse. Washington continues to print money at an alarming rate, fueling inflation and weakening confidence in the dollar. The more the US borrows, the greater the risk of a financial collapse that could shake the global economy. Investors and even foreign governments are beginning to ask, how long can the US keep this up? If the world loses trust in America's ability to manage its debt, the dollar could face a crisis unlike anything we've seen before. Trade deals bypassing the US, a shift to China and BRICS. For years, the US controlled global trade through institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and SWIFT financial system. But now, major economies are cutting America out of the equation. China has struck massive trade deals with Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, all in yuan, not dollars. BRICS nations are expanding their own financial networks, reducing reliance on Western-controlled banking systems. Regional trade agreements like RCEP, Asia, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, are making trade more independent from U.S. influence. With fewer countries needing U.S. dollars, demand for the currency is slowly declining, weakening one of America's greatest financial weapons. The sanctions backlash. America's power is fading. Sanctions have long been a tool of U.S. foreign policy, used to pressure countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. But lately, these measures are losing their bite. Russia, despite heavy U.S. sanctions, has strengthened trade ties with China, India, and the Middle East. Iran has found new ways to bypass sanctions, selling oil through alternative financial systems. Countries are ditching SWIFT, creating their own payment networks that cut Washington out of the equation. The message is clear. Nations are finding ways to operate without the U.S., making sanctions less effective and eroding one of Washington's most powerful tools of influence. With a rising debt crisis, trade shifting toward China and BRICS, and American sanctions losing their grip, the dollar's future is more uncertain than ever. Military and diplomatic challenges. For decades, U.S. military power was seen as untouchable. America led interventions, brokered peace deals, and shaped global policies. But today, that dominance is slipping. Failed wars, rising challengers, and growing resistance from smaller nations are changing the game. The fallout of failed U.S. interventions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were supposed to cement U.S. power, but instead, they damaged Washington's credibility. After 2 decades, trillions of dollars, and countless lives lost, the Taliban is back in power, and Iraq remains unstable. To the world, these wars signaled the limits of U.S. military power, proving that even with advanced weapons and intelligence, America couldn't force stability. This failure weakened U.S. influence, making allies and rivals alike question Washington's ability to maintain global order. China and Russia's military rise, a new challenge. While the U.S. struggled with long wars, China and Russia were building their military strength. China has rapidly modernized its armed forces, developing hypersonic missiles, expanding its navy, and asserting control in the South China Sea. Its military budget now rivals the U.S., and Beijing is forming deeper alliances with countries once dominated by Washington. Russia has proven it can defy the West. Despite heavy sanctions and military aid to Ukraine, Moscow has held its ground against NATO-backed forces. The war in Ukraine has exposed that Western military aid isn't always a guarantee of victory. More importantly, China and Russia are working together, holding joint military exercises, increasing arms trade, and challenging U.S. influence in key regions. This growing alliance is shifting power away from Washington. Nations resisting U.S. influence. The biggest sign of U.S. decline? Countries that once followed Washington's lead are now openly resisting. In the Middle East, longtime U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are making deals with China and Russia, moving away from Washington's control. In Africa, nations frustrated with Western policies are welcoming Chinese investment and Russian military support. Coup leaders in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have expelled French and U.S. forces in favor of Russian partnerships. In Latin America, leftist governments are rejecting U.S. interference, instead strengthening ties with China and BRICS nations. Across the world, the U.S. is no longer the automatic power broker. Nations now have options, and many are choosing to move away from Washington's grip. The global impact of a weaker America. For better or worse, U.S. dominance has been the foundation of global stability for decades. But if America's influence continues to fade, what happens next? A world without a clear superpower isn't necessarily a safer one. As U.S. leadership weakens, new powers are stepping in, but not all of them share the same vision for global stability. A power vacuum. Who steps in? If the U.S. can no longer act as the world's enforcer, who takes its place? China, with its growing economic and military might, Beijing is positioning itself as the next global leader. But would a world led by China be more authoritarian, with fewer freedoms and tighter economic controls? Russia? Moscow has shown that it's willing to challenge the U.S., but its leadership style often prioritizes hard power over diplomacy. A multipolar world? Some believe a world without a single dominant power could be more balanced, but history suggests otherwise. When multiple powers compete for influence, conflicts become more frequent, not less. The risks of a multipolar world: more conflicts, more instability. As the US loses influence, nations and regional blocs are pursuing their own interests, sometimes at the expense of global peace. More regional wars? Without US intervention, ongoing tensions in places like the South China Sea, Taiwan, and the Middle East could escalate into full-blown conflicts. Economic instability? If the dollar loses its dominance and global trade splinters into competing currency systems, financial markets could become more volatile, triggering global recessions. Weaker global governance? The US has played a key role in maintaining institutions like the United Nations, World Bank, and NATO. If its influence fades, these organizations could become weaker or irrelevant, leading to less cooperation on global crises like pandemics, climate change, and security threats. Is the world ready for the next chapter? America's decline doesn't just affect the US, it affects the entire world. While some see it as an opportunity for new powers to rise, others warn it could bring more uncertainty, instability, and even chaos. So is the world ready for life after American dominance? And if the US can't hold onto its power, who will? In conclusion, America is still a global powerhouse, its military remains the most advanced, the dollar is still the dominant currency, and its influence stretches across politics, trade, and culture. But the world is changing fast. New powers are rising, alliances are shifting, and economic systems are evolving. The question isn't just whether America is losing influence, it's whether it can adapt to this new reality or risk falling behind. So, what do you think? Is the US losing its grip on global power, or will it find a way to stay on top? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, we're watching closely.